Hi, Katie. Um, so today we are talking about trauma and how to be trauma informed as therapists and as lawyers. And I wanted to talk to you a little bit about, yeah, that whole idea of being kind of trauma informed and trauma itself and what that means really, because we hear a lot more about it these days, don't we? Which I think is a good thing about the importance of working in a trauma informed way. People talk a lot more about trauma. A few years ago, we wouldn't really have heard so much about that unless it was really serious events. So I wondered if you wanted to say a little bit about your experience of that.
Yeah, so in terms of my experience, during my training, I had the privilege to work at a rape and sexual abuse centre working with survivors. And that's where my training really started in terms of actually becoming more trauma informed and actually working in a way that is safe and promotes growth and can avoid any sort of re-traumatization and further harm.
Wow, that must have been, yeah, like you say, quite a privilege, but also interesting for you to be sort of exposed to all of that trauma, but to be doing that as a trainee therapist. So to have the sort of protections in place to kind of support you within that really important work.
Yeah.
Do you think it's possible to sort of define what trauma is, or is it a sort of massive concept that's quite hard to sort of pin down?
Well, I suppose there is a definition for what trauma is, and that comes from the APA, and it is that it's a traumatic incident where a person experiences, witnesses, or in certain circumstances hears about a threat to physical or psychological safety. And the response involves great fear, horror, and perhaps hopelessness as well. And it can be broken down into various levels. So there's the kind of primary trauma where you are there and the incident occurs to you. There's secondary trauma for those who witness it. So you'll see that a lot in personal injury cases. And in terms of vicarious trauma, which is the third category, and that refers to people who hear about traumatic incidents. And when looking at trauma through this lens, you really kind of see how pervasive it is in the legal world. Chances are at this very moment, there are countless solicitors across the UK listening to client accounts of their traumatic incidents, watching CCTV footage of traumatic injuries being sustained, and even reading witness statements. It's
Yeah.
important to note that traumatization can just be one exposure to a stimuli, but it can also be an accumulative condition. So it's really about that exposure. So this category is especially significant to those who work in an environment where they're exposed to traumatic stimuli on a regular basis. So that would be your personal injury lawyers, your family lawyers, in some cases, employment lawyers. It appears in every single sector.
Yeah, it does, doesn't it? And it kind of struck home for me recently because I was speaking at a criminal law conference, and the speakers before me was senior lawyers at the Hillsborough inquiry and the Manchester bombing, and there were Royal Mail postmistresses speaking at the conference as well who'd been wrongly imprisoned, and their lawyers. And you just think actually what people have been exposed to, obviously the people who've gone through these things themselves are absolute horror of it, but also the lawyers who are representing them. And traditionally we just have not had support to help people, or psychological support to help those lawyers deal with these situations. I don't know about you, but sort of back in the day when I was first in legal practice, I think there was a sort of feeling of you just need to not be so sensitive. You need to develop a thicker skin. And
Mhm.
there are many reasons, like physiological, neurological reasons why that just doesn't work, aren't there?
Yeah,
Um,
and I think it's quite natural to actually take that home at the end of the day. It's such a massive part of your work, and you hear firsthand these horrific stories, or you see the impact in terms of the person that's in front of you, and it's hard not to kind of connect on a human level to that trauma and to like have it linger and actually kind of resonate with you that way.
yeah, absolutely. And I remember during my therapeutic training where we learned about mirror neurons, and I was like, this is like a whole world opening up, like the idea that actually there neurologically in our brains we have empathy. We know empathy exists because we have these mirror neurons, and so when someone else is experiencing pain, we feel a version of that pain. And I remember learning about this and going, oh my God, like why did no one tell me this? I just thought I had to eliminate my sensitivity and then I'd be a good lawyer. And it's like, no, you cannot achieve that. And I think back in the day, we see some lawyers who tried to achieve that by sort of trying to shut down or repress their feelings. And that can be unhealthy. We all need to compartmentalize to an extent, don't we? But repressing your feelings too much is probably not the way to go.
No, I think there's a lot of lawyers out there that will wear their armor to work every single day and come home, but that impact will still be there regardless of the armor that you wear. And I always feel that sometimes actually being empathetic or saying empathy in a legal sector is almost like saying a bad word.
It's a dirty word. Absolutely. Or people say, oh, that touchy-feely stuff. It's like, no, it's not. This is not touchy-feely stuff. This is being a human being. And you can use that empathy to good effect. You know, it's important to be able to pick up on other people's emotions and moods. And I'm just wondering a bit, we talked about mirror neurons before, but also about this sort of the neurobiology of trauma, and people's kind of responses to trauma. And, is there anything kind of interesting there that lawyers could learn about?
Yeah, there's so much interesting. I'm not a neurologist in any shape, way, or form, but a kind of basic knowledge of how your brain works is really quite key to working in a trauma-informed way. So the kind of basic tenet is that our brains are there to keep us alive. They're not there to make us happy. Unfortunately, they're there to keep us alive. So when a traumatic incident occurs, it activates your amygdala, and that's part of your brain's emotional response system, which triggers your stress response. Everyone likes to quote fight or flight, but it's much more nuanced than that. So obviously you do have fight, which is that instinct to confront danger head on, even if that danger is an email. Flight, the response to kind of escape from the threat and actually create as much space between you and the threat as humanly possible. A lesser known one is friend, and that's really just about diffusing a situation. It's a bit of a lesser known response where you seek connection to appease in order to kind of create safety. And then if those kind of fail, your body might move on to freeze, which is a kind of immobile state, but you're like quite tense. And if that fails, your body then kind of moves towards flop, which is really similar to freeze in terms of you are kind of immobile, but all that kind of muscular tension is lost and your higher brain functions effectively go offline. And again, that is just to increase your survival of the impact of trauma.
It's really interesting what you say about our brains are geared to sort of keep us alive, rather than to make us happy. Because I think that is what can be so difficult for people who go through trauma is when their bodies respond in ways that they might not have expected. And to appreciate that that's a normal kind of physiological response rather than a failure of theirs. Like this idea of, oh, if someone attacked me, I would scream as loud as I can and run away. It's like, well, actually, there are many occasions where that's not what happens to the person who's under threat. And then sometimes they can end up blaming themselves because they think, well, I should have done this or I should have done that. And it's like, well, no, you can't help it.
Yeah, and it's useful to kind of, in terms of a psychoeducational kind of perspective, to say that all these responses are completely valid. And when your body does go into that kind of heightened state, like blood is actually diverted away from your brain. So your usual kind of, this is what I would do in that situation, like that kind of rational part of you isn't really there, but it does have so much more kind of impact on your brain as well, in terms of it can disrupt your hippocampus, so it affects where memories are formed and stored and retrieved, which leads to them being fragmented and maybe coming back as intrusive memories or flashbacks. And obviously prolonged exposure results to like elevated levels of cortisol and stress hormones, can influence your mood, your decision making, your psychological health overall. And it also has a negative impact on your immune system. And another kind of wonderful impact of trauma is that it impairs your prefrontal cortex. So really that control over your emotions and how you react to things. And especially for lawyers, it can impact your problem solving. And if you're not able to solve problems in an effective way, you're maybe not serving your client in the best way.
Yeah, it's fascinating, isn't it? Thinking about it, as you say, from the lawyer's perspective, but also, so many, when I think about lots of lawyers that I know and have worked with who've kind of gone through burnout and frustrations with the job, I think sometimes quite a lot of that is, or a contributing factor to that can be the frustrations of working with clients where you feel like they're not processing, they're not providing you with the information you've asked for. Instead of providing you with what you've asked for. They're providing you with a deluge of irrelevant information, etc., etc. And I think it can be really helpful for lawyers to understand that actually they might be doing that not because they're intentionally being obstructive, but because they have gone through some sort of trauma. Their brains are not able to filter information the way that you would want them to. Their memories are failing them in some ways. And I think sometimes just having that knowledge can be helpful for the lawyers to appreciate that and go, okay, and therefore there are ways in which I can work with such clients in a more trauma-informed way to help them rather than just kind of being very directive, which I think sometimes as lawyers, that's kind of the way that we're taught to approach things, which might not be very effective, particularly with this sort of client base.
Definitely. And I suppose a basic understanding of trauma and the impact would be really essential when working with clients that have been kind of impacted by trauma, and even in terms of how trauma might have impacted you and your work as a solicitor.
Yeah.
And even just that kind of human connection. I think we always have time, as regardless of how busy our days are, to always have time and patience for other people that might not have the same level of understanding of the legal system that we do. And just kind of a little bit more patience, about empathy is maybe what the legal sector really needs.
Yeah, and maybe a bit less time recording. That's another subject, but that's one thing that stands in the way of that patience, isn't it? But I think, as you say, it's really needed, that patience.